Our speaker today is Holly Nielson. She's Senior Funds Counsel of Vostok Capital Partners. She has over 20 years of experience in corporate and finance law, more than 12 years of experience living and working in Moscow. Although you're working from Kansas City at this point, right? She has also taken part in the Harvard University project, working as a senior advisor to the chairman of the Russian Securities Commission from 1995 until 1997. And she also took part in the creation of the first Russian investment fund in 1985. And, of course, she's a KU lawyer. I'm going to talk to us about Russian commercial law.
Well, thanks for sharing your lunch with me. And it's nice that it's kind of a small, informal group and we can sit around. I hope you don't mind my sitting rather than standing, but I think it makes for a better discussion. So I can talk for about 30 minutes and then we can discuss and you can ask questions. I hope you'll have a lot of them. But I also would love for you to interject with questions as we go along. It looks like this group has lots of different experiences. And so please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I prefer to have a lively discussion rather than just sit here and talk about my experiences. I think one of the most important things that Bart said is that I'm a 1982 KU law school grad. And so I remember when New Green Hole was really new. And at that time, we had no international classes. I mean, I think we had one Kansas City lawyer who used to come on Saturday mornings and do a seminar on international transactions, which I unfortunately never took and knew very few people who did. I mean, the world is very different today, and it's changed enormously in those 30 years. Companies are multinational now, and the globe is a very small place. And the law school now has some very noted professors in international subjects, both international public and private law. But I feel very fortunate to have kind of evolved in this way, rather than perhaps deciding at the outset that I was going to do international work. As Bart said, I've had the good fortune to live and work in Moscow for more than 20 years. I mean, I got there in January 1992, and still am working with Russia today, though for the last year and for the foreseeable future I'll do it remotely from Kansas City, which is nice for me at this point in my life. But working there as a lawyer has given me a really historic view of the transition in lots of different respects, sociologically, economically, but also because of my practice in law, I've been able to watch as this new legal system developed and what its interaction was with the new economy that was developing and the way transactions were done. And that's, I guess, what I'd like to focus on today, is just that incredible dynamism between the birth of a new democracy and commercial system and the legal framework that developed. And sometimes it developed in response to what was going on in the country, and a lot of times, I think much to my satisfaction, it kind of led the way, and it was important in how the new Russian economy developed. For me, and for Russia, the first attempt at a commercial law was in November 1987. And at that time, the Soviet Union adopted what was the first joint venture law. And in that law, it allowed foreign investment for the first time up to a 49% interest in a joint venture. And I had the good fortune at that time to be working for a law firm in Houston, Texas. And the first companies, because of the natural resources, obviously, that were in the Soviet Union and in particular in Russia, the very first companies to begin taking advantage of that joint venture law were the energy companies. And a lot of those were based in Houston, Texas. And I happened to be in Houston with a large law firm doing real estate and oil and gas and corporate work. So I was able, both because of an interest and some language skills I had begun to develop in college in the mid-70s, was able to take advantage of that and begin to work with people like Exxon and Pennzoil and Dresser and some of these companies as they began to look at doing business in the Soviet Union. It was very rudimentary joint venture kinds of business back then, but as you know, the world continued to change on a very fast track. And so in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved after the Berlin Wall had come down, and we had 13 countries instead of the Soviet Union. And it then, of course, began to change very quickly to a democracy and a market-based economy. But because of that joint venture law, some of what I think of as the early international law firms, people like Baker McKenzie, Couder Brothers, those who really specialized, and there were only a handful at that time, and law firms were not very international back then. And those law firms began to set up offices in the late 80s in Moscow. Couder Brothers, via a guy named Richard Dean, was the first. Baker McKenzie very quickly after them, and then another handful of law firms. So I was able in January 1992 with the law firm that I was with in Houston, because of this oil and gas business that was beginning to develop, able to go to Moscow. And then shortly thereafter we decided to set up an office, and now there are probably about 40 or 50 different, primarily American and British law firms that are in Moscow, but other nationalities as well. So it all began with that first joint venture law. And people always say to me, well, you know, was there law in the Soviet Union? And the answer is, of course, there was a very well-developed body of law and various codes of law. But they had no relevance, and there was no basis for either a democratic or a commercial system. The laws that were in place for many decades in the Soviet Union were there to support a planned, state-owned, communist economy and political system. So there were, for instance, there was no private property. People had rights to apartments, and people had rights to dacha and perhaps the land under them, but there was really, with a few very minor exceptions, there was no private property. The means for production were all owned by the state. There really was no retail service to speak of. Foreign trade was organized through the foreign trade organizations. And there was no commercial, no private commercial activity. So obviously no laws to support that. And in fact, the laws that did relate to that said you may not. So again, there was a very well-developed system of legal system, but not one for private commerce or democracy, for that matter, of course. There was full employment, but very little freedom, and of course the borders were very closed and were very controlled. So after the Soviet Union dissolved and these 13 states were set up, there were some very important and very, very rudimentary changes that happened in March 1992. And again, I was kind of fortunate to get there in January 1992. So I feel very grateful for seeing essentially the first 20 years of this particular development. But in March of 1992, when Russia decided it would be democratic and it would have a market-based economy, a fellow by the name of Gaidar decided that there were some very basic things that needed to happen first. Quite a smart fellow, and took about 5 decisions that just overnight completely changed the face of the country, and Moscow in particular. So again, in March 1992, I'm sorry if I said 82, March 92, commerce became legal. You could engage in private commerce without being put in jail. Prices were floated. The Soviet Union had set very arbitrary pricing, which made no sense from a demand and supply sort of perspective, so that people could actually make profit rather than having prices controlled. The currency was liberalized. The ruble up to that point had been kept at sort of 1-to-1 to the dollar. And that had no basis in a market economy. So the ruble was allowed to float, which was a terribly controversial decision because people's savings bank accounts were wiped out overnight. In the end, there was really little else to do, but that was a terribly difficult decision. And borders were opened. For the first time, private import and export activity was allowed. And those 4 or 5 decisions, as I said, just changed the face of the country overnight. And what you began to see by about February was long lines, miles of lines of people literally standing on the sidewalk holding an item in each hand to sell. It was a very desperate time. As I like to say to people, imagine waking up and having someone say to you, you know, we're sorry we promised something different, but the system is, you know, 180 degrees today. We don't really know that it's going to work. We wish you good luck. We're not going to take care of you for the rest of your life, and good luck. And so 1992, 1993 was a really very difficult period, but you began to see the blossoming of commerce, and people were selling things. Most of the, you know, what had been state shops or state restaurants, or even some of the early privately owned restaurants, kind of all, for the most part, went out of business, and it was very dark on the streets. But then there were these signs of private commerce. First, people standing, holding items. Then you would see very kind of nicely marketed card tables, and then, you know, some really badly manufactured kiosks began to appear on every street corner, and there were exchange offices again on every corner for exchanging currency. People became very savvy about exchanging currency to try to arbitrage. And people began to rent apartments. One of the very first privatization efforts was in the housing stock. And that happened very quickly in 1992. And it was interesting, you know, how kind of quickly people took to commerce and really understood what they were doing. And so with very little paperwork and effort and no money, you could go down to, you know, the sort of the city hall, if you will, or the municipal offices, and privatize your apartment. And people did that very quickly. And within months, 80–90% of the housing stock was privatized. And then people began to rent out their apartments, sublease their apartments, and do various things to earn money. So again, that was one of the very early changes. The next thing that began to happen was an effort to privatize the commercial economy. The housing stock had been a very quick and successful privatization effort. And the next thing that needed to happen was to privatize the corporate commercial system. All of these state-owned companies needed to be put into private hands. And as most of you know, I'm sure, having studied the privatization effort in Russia, it's not without its controversy either. And that was something that was very much led by people, but also laws. The law on privatization is not a very complicated, certainly not a very long law in terms of its page length. As I recall, it's maybe even 15 pages. And a fellow named Chubais really spearheaded that effort. And Chubais's philosophy at the time was that it needed to be done quickly, that there was going to be a very short window of political will, and if privatization didn't happen quickly, it wouldn't happen at all, or it wouldn't happen at all, basically. A lot of people took issue with that. There are countries like China that have done it very, very differently. And there were certainly a number of people arguing at the time that what Russia needed to do was get these companies in shape to be able to privatize them in a way that maximized their value, in a way that Western Europe had privatized the decades before. And again, the argument on the other side was if we don't do it now, it will never happen. So this law, 15-page law on privatization, was adopted, pushed through the Parliament really quite quickly. And from 1992 until 1994, there was a very relatively fast process of voucher privatization. That was interesting from a lot of different respects. The vouchers, which were given to each citizen, was a relatively democratic process. It was interesting in a very, very primitive securities or capital market sense, because these vouchers were tradable and their prices weren't set. So you had what developed into a very active capital market, or they were a security. They were, by every definition, a security. And what I always found very interesting and odd, but seemed to kind of be a harbinger of everything else to come, was that they were never restricted in terms of who could buy them. Foreigners could buy them, just like Russians could buy them. There was a very freely tradable market in them. Prices weren't set. It was an incredibly open, level playing field for everyone, including foreigners. And that's the way the market, in my experience, developed after that, which is completely different from the way, for instance, China has developed. In China, you have lots of restrictions on foreign investment. You have Class A shares for Chinese and Class B shares for foreigners, and it's been a very restricted market. Most people are very surprised to hear that Russia, from day one, has been a really very open, level playing field for foreign investment as well as domestic investment. And I think that kind of all goes back to voucher privatization. There were different ways to privatize. The employees of a company, together with management, could privatize. That became what's called insider privatization, because the employees needed the cash, didn't really understand what was going on. The managers, who were a little bit more savvy, were able to say, you know, let me hold your vouchers in trust, and we'll have this employee-owned company. And that, of course, then led to insider privatization. And the people who had been the directors of these companies during the state period continued to be the directors of these companies, and people would call them the red directors, because essentially, because of the way privatization was carried out, it was very much an insider privatization, and to some extent pretty corrupt. But overnight, again, at least in you know, time as most of us think of it, in 2 years anyway, the economy went from 0% privately owned to 70% privately owned, and that's pretty incredible. We can all debate whether Chubais and others made the right decision, but you know, it's in some respects, I think it's kind of hard to argue, because I'm not sure it would have been any less corrupt, and I tend to agree with him that it may not have happened if it hadn't happened pretty quickly. But the problem with that then was that you had these companies, as they were privatized either by their employees or in auctions. There were also auctions, which again sort of mimicked a capital market or a securities market, and gave people an early experience in trading platforms, and then kind of led to the capital markets development. The other thing that is interesting about this time, and the price issue, the pricing, and the way prices were allowed to float and import and export were allowed to happen, is that you also saw during this period from about 91 to 94, 95, a lot of incredible entrepreneurial activity. You know, if you were 30, 40, 50, 60, and you had mouths to feed at home, and you know, a job that you were worried about, or you were, you know, out in the middle of Siberia somewhere, you know, it was a very, very, very difficult time. But if you were 18, 20, 25, and a child of perestroika, and you know, not as concerned and not with as many responsibilities, it was a time of incredible opportunity. And I think that's why today you see, you know, CEOs of Russian companies who tend to be about 35 years old. But there was a lot of entrepreneurial activity, and the early entrepreneurial activity that allowed some of these very wealthy oligarchs like Berezovsky and Kaczynski and Katanin and Tarkovsky to develop the wealth that they did, as well as the experience that they did, was arbitrage between domestic prices and foreign prices. There were a handful of people who understood that while the domestic economy was still heavily subsidized, they could sell things, especially natural resources, on the external market for prices that were 3, 4, 20 times what they could buy them for in Russia. And so you saw a lot of people amass a lot of wealth. But there was also a lot of very positive, healthy entrepreneurial activity that took place, and a lot of amassing of wealth by people who I think deserved it. One of my favorite stories was working with a couple of entrepreneurs from St. Petersburg who during that time realized that abroad people drank juice out of these packs that a company called Tetra Pak would produce. And in Russia, it might have come out of a machine, or maybe it came out of a bottle or whatever, and wasn't pasteurized and wouldn't sit on the shelf for as long. And anyway, these very, very young entrepreneurs did a deal with Tetra Pak to buy the product, set up a very simple factory, and 10 years later had the #2 juice business in Russia that they sold to Coca-Cola about 4 years ago for multi-millions of dollars. So there was a lot of that. The mobile phone companies are another great example. It's just no one had a landline. People were waiting 10 and 20 years to get a landline, and overnight everybody had 3 cell phones. This infrastructure for cell phones was very, very fast to set up. And all of that was sort of happening during this very kind of paranoid but primitive and in a healthy way privatization period of 92, 94. Post-privatization, you had all these new companies that were in private hands and no commercial legal system. So there was another sort of period of racing against the clock from about 94, 95, really until the crash of the ruble in 98, when this incredible, very complicated and, in my view, very good legal system got put on the books. And there were lots of technical aid projects. There were lots of Russian institutes that got into this business. And essentially, they looked around the world and figured out what the corporate laws were, what the securities laws were, what the tax laws were, and began to develop a commercial legal system, and had the ability, had to do it very quickly, but had the ability to look at what worked and what didn't work in other parts of the world, to work with foreign advisors. And for example, the Russian joint stock company law today, I think, takes the best from corporate law everywhere, and is frankly much better than what we have in Delaware or Texas or Kansas or Missouri. It's really a very well thought out and well working joint stock company law that has much more minority shareholder protection than what you find in lots of other local corporate laws. Probably the greatest success in terms of law that had a huge impact was the reform of the tax law. In the very early days, when the Russians needed some form of state revenue and had to, knew that they needed to tax their citizens, they kind of looked around the world, and instead of rationalizing it, but perhaps predictably at the time, because it had to be done so quickly, they sort of, they went, profits, VAT, and they took every possible tax law that they found around the world and they adopted them, and all of a sudden you found, that everybody had to work in the gray market, because if you reported your earnings as a company from your business activity, you'd be paying about 140% in tax. So it didn't work, and that unfortunately made for a system for years where everyone had to avoid taxes in rather malicious schemes, and then led on down the line to people being able to be prosecuted for that. When I can tell you that 100% of the people doing business activity in the early 90s were doing it in some sort of gray way. But finally, by about 1995 till about 97, 98, the Ministry of Finance had a very brilliant guy named Shatalov, who had the time over the course of about 3 or 4 or 5 years to really better study the tax laws and how they worked rather than just what they were, and was able then to adopt in 3 different parts a new tax code. And Russia today has the lowest corporate tax rate in Europe. It has the lowest individual tax rate in Europe, which is 13%. If I do my Russian tax return, it's 5 pages, not 5 inches. And it's a huge, huge, not only advantage, but betterment, I suppose, of what we have in the U.S. for tax law. We talk about tax reform today, and you know, we ought to take a look at what Russia did about 5 or 6 years ago. And it made an enormous difference because all of a sudden, overnight, everybody became compliant. Individuals, companies, because it was, instead of all the energy that went into avoiding tax and offshore pricing schemes and all kinds of things, if you were paying 13% as an individual or 23% as a company, it made more sense to pay that and use your energy in other ways. And so almost overnight, the federal budget, tax revenues went up about tenfold, and people really, in the matter of years, became tax compliant.
What year was that when they became compliant?
Well, I think it's probably about 96, 97 when there was a huge change of attitude. There was another step up in that after Hordakovsky got, went to jail because it was the tax avoidance which the Russians were able to use, perhaps selectively, but he certainly had avoided tax, and that was what they were able to use to get him on. The law on securities was adopted in '97, and Russia today has a very dynamic capital market, not one that's considered yet an international exchange. A lot of Russian IPOs are still done in London or even in New York, but it's a very functioning capital market. I said that I would only talk for about 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap up and you can ask me questions. There's just an enormous amount to say. I think the question I get asked today is, does Russia have a rule of law? And my answer to that is that it absolutely has great laws on the books. The task for the last few years and the next few decades is to put those into practice so that they develop, so that people understand and know them. There's been, there needs to be more work in terms of the judiciary being independent and not corrupt. It tends to be difficult if you're out in the regions and at a local court. By the time you get to an appellate court in Moscow or St. Petersburg, the decisions are really quite good. And it's something that's evolving. It's going to take a lot more time. So I guess what I would say is that after the first 10 years, the legal system on the books is great. But it's going to take a while for enforcement and respect for that to develop. But it certainly is very, very different than when I was practicing law and trying to do transactions in the mid-90s or even the late 90s in Russia. So I'm going to quit talking for a while. If you have specific questions, I'd be happy to try to answer.